Hello and welcome back to Beaver Hunter Scale Models. In this video I will show how I painted and weathered the diorama, including the barn I built in the last video. So please enjoy and have fun. This is the scene after the build, and for painting I put it apart. But before I started priming, I used Tamiya's metal primer for the roof's ridge, because this was made from copper foil, and with that I was sure the paint would adhere better. Then I was good to start with priming the whole project. I decided for AK's black acrylic primer, because I was sure it would not harm the foam. If I would have used solvent-based primer, there would be the risk it would melt the foam, and obviously I want to take no risk here, especially at the barn. At the small wall and the barn stone wall I had to make sure to get the primer in all joints and therefore sprayed the pieces from all angles. I did not want to end up with the shiny green foam shining through somewhere. And I pre-painted the whole wooden frame of the base plate and backside of the barn as a foundation for later brush painting, as I had the black primer in my airbrush anyway. Then I started with painting the barn because I was impatient to see it finished, and this is the color palette I will use for that. A lot grays, rusty orangish and earthen tones. I started with randomly painting single stones with the first two gray paints. This whole process took me actually more time than I expected. Turns out painting these natural stones with all these different sizes and shapes takes a lot more time than a brick wall or house. I then started with adding the more colorful and bright colors. I here picked the stones randomly again and tried to not end up with a repeating pattern. And I wanted the general look to be more grayish, so I had to be careful to not overdo it. Of course, this is looking very awkward and strange with all these bright and funny colors, but this will change later, at least I hope. And after I used all to me suitable paints, I filled up the remaining spots with a gray tone again to get into the wanted grayish direction. And with that first paint on the barn, it began to look a bit more like a building. I like it to work out the details with paint out of a completely black piece. The small wall which will stand next to the house was painted using the same color palette, but I wasn't focused on keeping it more grayish and it came out even more colorful. To break the pretty boring and simple surface of the wall, I mixed me a light paint with a lot of retarder and tap water, so it has almost no coverage, and applied that mix over the bigger and biggest stones. Like this, I wanted to create an impression of variation and fake highlights, as well as some stone-like texture, although the effect here was very subtle. And because I diluted it with retarder, the paint kept workable longer and I could blend it into the surface with a dry brush. To start with the cornerstones, I base painted them with a grain tone I used on the natural stones to tone down the black a bit. Next I mixed me a lighter grey tone and that, slightly diluted, applied over the first tone. Like this, the lighter tone was working out better over the dark black. And in the still wet grey paint I worked the bright off-white wet in wet. Like this, I wanted to break the grey surface and imitate a stone-like surface. And with the brush almost dry, I worked the paint into the previous layer with a stippling motion. After that had time to dry, I made a wash with a dark grey paint to bring out and emphasize the deeper spots, almost a kind of pin wash. I here also played around with the brush in the still wet paint to push it around and place it where I wanted it to be. Again, the wall's top tiles were painted in the same way like the cornerstones to match the look to that of the house. Dry brushing helped me to bring out and highlight all raised spots and gives the stones a slightly worn out look. To give the stones more shape and character, I used the same paint I used for dry brushing to repaint the edges and area around deeper spots, and with that emphasize the contrast between higher and lower areas. Like this, the stones lost their grayish flat surface and got more texture. Now I could finally fill up the joints, and for this I used Juweela's grout for joints. This stuff is super fine but still has some texture compared to maybe plaster, so it was an easy choice. I applied it onto the facade and used a soft dry brush to push it around and into the joints. The excess was pushed over the edge and could be saved for later use. And with a slightly stronger brush, more excess was removed and the final shape of the joints created. Then I dripped VMS sand and ballast freeze onto the surface and with that fixed the joints in place. This stuff is great because it runs into the joints and doesn't melt the styrofoam. And the effect to the look of the barn is also great, because suddenly the strange ugly look is almost gone, as the grout now creates a dusty uneven look and tones down the colors a lot. But as the VMS stuff is drying out glossy, it is better to not overdo it with the application and maybe even remove the excess before it dries. When the VMS fixer was dry, I made a wash over the whole stoned area with a light paint to lighten up the joints. This also helps to highlight the texture I applied in the building video and the remains of the grout on the stones. This wash was followed by a wash with light mud, and this gave the whole facade a dusty, weathered look matching to the summer scene I want to create. These two washes in combination with the grout turned the look from toy-like plastic to an almost realistic stone facade. And with a dark brown wash I applied in the deeper joints and gaps, I created some fake shadows and with that made the facade look a bit more irregular and less straight. And before the wash dried, I cleaned the areas I touched with the brush using a dry brush, so only the joints became darker, not the stone surface. With the natural stones done, I could concentrate on the plaster remnant areas and I started with base painting them with a medium grey color. I then made a wash with a darker paint to give the plaster some depth and texture, and I used a warmer tone here. And while the first wash was still wet, I applied an even darker wash and let it blend itself to create a bit variation in the surface and give even more depth. When the washes were dry, I again used the magic of dry brushing to bring out the raised details of the plaster. I here had some more paint than usual in the brush because I wanted the plastered areas to become significantly lighter. But with the dark underlayer I created before still visible. Then I started weathering the plaster and add some dirt accumulations. I therefore used dark brown acrylic paint and diluted it highly with paint drying retarder. And because the paint was diluted with retarder, it stayed workable longer and I could blend it into the previously applied layers with a brush. The blending brush was also moistened with retarder, and with that much retarder the paint had no chance to dry fast and leave tight marks. With the diluted paint I started to apply dirt streaks from dirt running down the facade. And when the diluted paint finally dried, I reinforced the streaks with almost pure paint for a stronger effect. And the transition of the barn from toil to real building was a step further, and I was very satisfied with the progress so far. Next point on the to-do list was the roof, and I started with base painting Juweela's iron sheetings with a medium grey paint. For the roof's ridge I chose a different grey for some variation, but this later turned out useless because of the weathering. And because the roof was lacking some details to me, I quickly mounted these fasteners from styrene rod and painted them too. I then used an almost white paint, again highly diluted with retarder, to highlight the raised spots of the sheetings, to bring some contrast to the sheets and simulate some wear and tear. From this point on it was, like often in scale modeling, about trying and finding out. I had an idea how I wanted the roof to look, I just had to figure out how to get there. But with some patience and some good feedback from my modeling friends, I think I was successful. But let's take it step for step. I continued with applying acrylic rust tones in a wash-like consistence, again, and like all following paints, diluted with retarder, so the paint stays workable longer. I started with the darkest rust tone on the upper areas of the sheets and then became lighter to the lower areas. Like this, I wanted to create some contrast between the single sheets. I used the rust tones wash-like, so the grey underlayer with the light highlights could shine through, almost like rusting an exhaust, but in a bigger scale. And that's why I applied the rust tones by stippling here and there and not completely covering. But the result was that the rust tones were too dominant and overwhelming, even for my taste, and I usually like it very rusty. So I grabbed me the grey spray paint and applied it on top of the rust tones with a sponge to counteract the rust tones. The same was repeated with the lighter paint to again create some highlights and wear and tear of the sheets. And now with the acrylic stage done, it already looked very promising. But I wanted to try to push it further. So I grabbed me some enamel rust paints and repeated the steps again I previously made with the acrylic rust paints. And that would be apply the darkest rust streaks over the upper areas of the sheetings and became lighter to the lower areas. I applied all three tones when the previous ones were still wet, and like this could easily mix them and blend them into each other. And after they had a few minutes to dry, I blended them into the roof surface using a thinner moistened brush. To get the deeper gutters darker, I applied a brown wash with a green accent in a big amount and let it run down the deepenings. Like this, without any blending, the wash dried and left tight marks at the edges, almost like dirt which accumulates in these deepenings and got rinsed away from rain. All I made was removing the drops of excess wash with a brush which were collecting at the ends of the sheetings. After drying, I applied decay deposits diluted with thinner in a small amount on the top areas of the sheetings. This was supposed to give the sheetings an old metal-like look. And with moss deposits, what I applied in the deepenings and on top the lower areas of the sheetings, I wanted to give the roof an impression of being exposed to rain and weather with building up verdigris. Because some enamel products dried out glossy, most likely because they aren't the youngest anymore, I finished the roof with a nice coat of flat varnish. Bergswerk's clear coat here delivered the best result as always, a rich flat finish, impossible to overdo it and end up with a milky coat. With the roof done, all that was left on the barn were the wooden parts. I here started with applying a light wooden tone, thicker and thinner in different strengths over the thick black base paint of all wooden slats. Like this, the look slowly changed and let the dark undercoat look through. Next I used a different wooden tone and again applied it thicker and thinner over the previous painted slats. Obviously I did it the other way around here. Thin paint on thick paint from before and vice versa. Then I used deck tan, again thicker and thinner, and applied it over all slats. This gave the wood a first touch of wear and tear and being old wood. And speaking of old wood, this was the next tone applied in the same way like the deck tan before. With an orangish tone I painted the upper parts of the slats and dragged the paint down with a brush. This was to simulate fresher, less weathered wood from being protected by the lintel or the crossbars. In the building video I carved some kind of wood grain into the balsa wood slats and here I used dark brown enamel wash to emphasize this. This wash not only brings out the wood grain, it also helps to turn down the bright wooden colors. And as always, this is looking way more dramatic when the wash is still wet. As a finishing touch I made a dry brushing with a lighter color again to highlight the raised areas, edges of the slats and bring back some color after the wash. This was applied more randomly over the slat surface for some variation and randomness. And as a last detail I painted nails into the slats with dark brown paint. This adds some more details, and although the slats could be fastened from the doors inside, this is the proof that they aren't floating. For some more details I wanted to add some moss. I therefore applied undiluted wood glue, precisely by brush, and sprinkled some fine turf by Woodland Scenics on top of that. The facade and wood also got their share of moss, but just a slight amount in places like gaps from missing stones or on top of crossbars. And as I usually tend to overdo it with weathering effects, I was happy that I could control myself here, at least I think so. But as always, things can be improved and I didn't want it to stay in this slightly plastic-like look, so I of course had to get some paint on it. When the turf and glue dried, I started with applying diluted khaki paint. This was to make the moss look not completely fresh and a bit dry, like it could be in summer. The turf almost acted like a sponge and soaked up the paint. I then applied a vivid fresh green into the still wet khaki paint, and like this the paints flew into each other and blended themselves. And to represent that moss and highlight it a bit from the roof, I framed it partly with applying a dark brown paint here and there. To add some more vegetation details, I applied the khaki and green and also some decay by speckling. This was to represent small moss blobs and lichen, a common thing to grow on surfaces exposed to weather impacts. And with a strongly diluted green tone, I implied the presence of verdigris and moss on the lower wooden parts and the facade. The paint was diluted heavily here, so I could blend it into the surface with a moistened brush. I didn't want the effect to be too overwhelming. And with that, the wall, which was painted and weathered in the same way like the barn, and the barn itself were finished and put aside, so I could start painting the base. At the beginning, I started with spraying the grass tufts and the wild weeds in a medium dark green tone. The overspray resulting here is no problem, as this will be fixed with the following paints. But first I brought some variation into the grass by spraying some highlights. I herefore lightened the dark green base paint with a yellowish paint and applied it in 3 rounds of highlights. And each time I applied it in a smaller amount on a smaller area, mostly in the higher area of the grass. And as I already had the light green paint in my airbrush, I used it to base paint some paper nettles I want to build for the scene. With the greens done, I quickly sprayed the earth in the joints in a matching earth color, and again did not worry much about the overspray. The reason for spraying the joints is to have a foundation for later enamels. Then I sprayed a light grey tone on top of the concrete slabs. I made sure to spray it in a cloudy pattern, not to covering the black primer completely. And here I could fix all the overspray that happened before. As the last step in the airbrush stage, I sprayed the rubble areas with a dark grey as a foundation for later painting. I then switched to brushes and started to finish the concrete slabs with applying a light grey paint, highly diluted with tap water, so it doesn't cover the underlayer completely. In the still wet paint, I then applied a heavily diluted brown paint to let it flow in all cracks, crevices and deeper spots, and apply dirt and fake shadows on the slabs. And as a counterpart to the darker areas, I wanted to highlight raised spots and areas around cracks. Here again came the point of to try and find out, as I tested various approaches how to get where I wanted to end up. I diluted the paint with water or retarder, I applied it almost undiluted, tried to blend it or applied it wet in wet. In the end, I'm still not sure what was the best way to do it, but these different approaches led to a very interesting irregular result and an interesting looking surface. And to bring out the raised spots more and highlight the slab's edges and cracks, I finished the surface with a dry brushing, an old but gold technique that more than once saved the day for me. And considering I again had no real plan, I think the result isn't that bad. I then concentrated on the rubbled areas, and I here picked out just some single small stones and painted them in various grayish tones to bring some variation into the monotonous dark gray area. Obviously the plan was not to paint each piece of rubble individually, but just to get some variation into this gray mess. And the bricks buried in the rubble were painted too. I here used different brown tones from a rust color set which worked perfectly here. With a dark brown wash I created some fake shadows in the deeper gaps, and with light mud I made a wash to add some dust and grout texture, especially to the bricks. And with dry brushing I again highlighted raised spots and implied the look of cracks and worn out edges as of the bricks and stones. Again this time there was more paint than usually in the brush to increase the effect. With the groundwork done I could then finally glue the barn in place. Always a very exciting moment to finally bring together what belongs together and see how all paints and effects work out together. The small wall was also glued in place and arranged in the right angle. And when the glue was dry and everything safe, I used Bergwerk spatula to fill the gaps between the backside of the house, wall and base plate. This spatula is a perfect all-rounder and more than suitable for this job, as it dries without shrinking and with a very smooth surface. The little imperfections due to my spatula skills were later sanded smooth and with that ready for painting later. I then had to level the barn and wall to the base plate, and I here placed real earth from my garden without trademark and brushed it against the barn to cover the gap and pretend to be dirt accumulated at the wall. This was then fixed in place using sand and ballast trees again, which not only fixed the earth in place but also strengthened the bond between barn and base. And to make the dirt a bit more interesting, I placed some of AK's dried seagrass and fixed that too with VMS. I then had to adapt the earth and dirt visually to the scene, and I herefore used the same enamel products I used to mud the tank and that will be placed here. I started with the light dry earth by Mig and applied it by brush diluted with thinner so it doesn't cover the ground completely. Just like at the tank, I then applied the medium tone summer kursk earth into the still wet dry earth, let it blend itself or helped a bit with pure thinner applied by brush. And for some fake shadows and to simulate some moisture in the deeper spots, I used loose grout again like I did it on the tank. I then used the same products to adapt the joints visually to the rest. Dry earth was followed by the medium kursk earth, wet and wet, and the darker loose ground for the deeper shadowed or moistened spots. And these products had some time to dry. I used a dark brown wash to do a kind of pin wash to outline small stones and to add some more darkness and the impression of moisture and shadows to the deepest spots and also joints. Then I could start the final chapter, and that would be vegetation. I started with giving the base some more variation by painting single leaves of the grass mat I glued in the first part. I therefore used different light greens and picked out the leaves randomly, and with that broke up the monotone look a bit. And to vary the grass tufts more, I used heavily lightened green to imply some drier grass and setting some accents here and there. As I wanted to make the vegetation and with that the scene in general more interesting, I got me some of these ivy plants by Diorama Presepe. They look very interesting and detailed, but as I used them for the first time, I had to figure out how to use them best. The instructions said to glue the roots to the object where you want the ivy to be and then glue the foliage to the roots. But as I didn't want to glue anything to the barn at this stage, I tried it with gluing the foliage directly to the roots and ending up with complete plants. But my success using superglue was limited and I tried a different approach. This time I wrapped the foliage around the roots and then dripped VMS sand and balustries on top of that. In general, this method was faster and not less successful than using superglue. When the ivy had some time to dry, I glued it to the scene, and as I wanted the corner to be very green and wild, I glued two of the ranking plants here. And for some detail in viewing direction, I glued one part to the front of the barn, implying that the plant is growing from the blind side next to the barn into the scene. To emphasize the wildness of the meadow, I wanted to add some paper nettles by Migs. Because the supplied rods from the sets were too big and unnatural to me, I switched these for some real plant stems. The rest of the set was looking pretty nice and detailed, and as they were the first paper plant I made, it took me some time and practice to bring the parts together. But with patience and great superglue in combination with activator spray, this was doable too, although I almost broke my eyes here. To adapt the plants optically to the scene, I painted the stems on the bigger ones with a dark brown color and on the smaller ones in bright green. This is to make the small ones look fresher and younger and what real life references showed me. And to finish them, I made a wash with AK's moss deposits to create some depth and unifying the look. Then these beauties, which I am very satisfied and happy with, were also glued in place and the wild natural corner of the scene took shape with every piece planted. With some flowers from Diorama Presepe, I wanted to add the cherry to the cake. I first thought about giving them some touches with paint here and there, but that didn't work out and didn't look good, so I just planted them how they are. And as a cool detail, I could add some dried blossoms from mint plants from my garden, which were a nice fit to this corner. With that, the vegetation was done, and all that was left to do on the base was painting the frame with the final layer of Tamiya black. As I used balsa wood for the frame, there was no nice wood grain I could highlight, but that's okay for me as I like dark frames too. Then I placed the tank to see how the scene worked out and to finally see all components together. I didn't fix it permanently now because I first want to finish the figures and then find the perfect position for all pieces. And with that, we finally made it through my longest single video so far. If you are still here, thanks a lot for watching. I really appreciate that. I hope you like the diorama as much as I do, and maybe I could inspire you and give you some ideas. I had an idea when I started this diorama, and as always it developed while building. But after I spent so much time on the Panther, I wanted it to be a quick and smooth project, what of course didn't work out again. But as always, I think it was worth taking the extra time in my view. Figures will be the next chapter for this project, and then I should be done with this. But that's a story for another day. Thanks again for watching, stay safe, and until the next time.